We are in week 2 of the May Bible reading, which brings us to the book of Nahum. So if you will head over there, we'll talk about that a little bit today. The book of Nahum. It's still working on the big theme of divine judgment. And as I was thinking about that, it occurred to me that as you picked readings for 2024, it must have been difficult just to figure out which ones to use.
Well, for this theme,
because so much of the prophets is about judgment.
yeah.
And
This was picking from too many options.
that's right. So
Yeah,
so you've selected Nahum chapter 1.
yeah.
And notice he only takes us through verse 14. And I bet if you listen to this podcast regularly, you know why. It's because Jeff does not like the chapter division at the end of verse 15 of chapter 1. So anyway,
Something like that.
let's talk a little bit about, of all the possibilities, why Nahum. Because the first thing I notice is that Nahum is not even really about Israel or Judah.
No, that's right. That's right. Yeah, so a couple of things. Number one, just per one of our goals this year, read in some of the least read parts of the Bible.
Yeah.
And so, given that you don't often hear a sermon or a Bible class on Nahum from Nahum, let's read part of God's inspired word that is very unfamiliar territory for us. And one of the things I do like about Nahum, though, also concretely is, Nahum, exactly because it was not about Israel or Judah and or God's judgment on his people for their sins and their covenant breaking. It was about God's judgment on Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, one of the great world empires of that era.
And a big oppressor of God's people at that
A big
time.
oppressor of God's people. And so fundamentally, it was basically to Gentiles who did not have the law of Moses, did not have, what's the point here? Drive home a couple of things. Number one, that, first of all, God will judge those who hurt his people. But beyond that, to remind us that even back then, before the coming of Jesus, even if you didn't get the law of Moses, there still was moral accountability to God. Even the Gentiles were judged by God. We forget that sometimes. We think only Israel could be judged for
Right.
sin. Sin is sin.
Or that God didn't even care about the other
That's
nations.
right. That's right. And if you read Nahum, especially it's only 3 chapters, and it was our prophet of a month or two ago anyway. So hopefully you read it back then. This is just a refresher now. But part of what the reality is, the whole world is under judgment for sin. And the Gentiles were never getting off just because they didn't have the covenant of Moses. They had sin and they were to be judged for sin. And so here comes Nahum, delivered the oracle there. And and ultimately Nahum, unlike Jonah, was not sent to Nineveh. Nahum's oracle was meant to be heard by the people of God to recognize that God will judge those who sin against you. And if there is anything in that, then it's also, besides that God will take care of his people. Maybe you should quit out your own sin before this happens to you.
Yeah, there would be a lesson that way, wouldn't there?
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about what he says in chapter 1 that really caught your attention.
Yeah. So I think there's a few things that we can learn, and this is fairly standard for a lot of judgment texts. If you do read around the prophets a lot, it's not just, you're going to die, God's going to destroy you. There's some concrete stuff going on here. First of which is at the beginning of the chapter, I'm thinking verses 3, 4, 5, one of the things that often is affected in judgment is nature. And kind of the mark of God's coming in judgment is not just you're going to die, but everything around it's going to be destroyed. And you can almost see, there are a couple of passages, one in Jeremiah, I'm thinking one in Zephaniah, where it's even clearer. Part of judgment is God uncreating things into destruction, or maybe a story from Genesis when God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain. And it wasn't just that everybody died. The whole area physically was obliterated.
Right.
That when it gets
Like
to
the flood.
yeah, or like the flood,
same kind of deal.
and ultimately like the second coming of Jesus, when
Right.
those were all those geographic devastations were not just the people, but the geography was remade,
Right.
in the devastation, meant to remind us ultimately down payments of the second coming of Jesus, when the real fire's coming. And creation is going to be destroyed, melt, as I think Peter's talking, the elements melting in the heat, So creation often withers and is destroyed, or that's part of the imagery. That's fairly common in judgment passages. Second one is no matter how powerful, or we might say how healthy or wealthy you are, don't think you're going to be able to escape judgment. And so again, verses like verse 9, why do you plot against the Lord? He will make a complete end, and trouble will not arise a second time. Or verse 12, though they are at full strength, you think Nineveh can't fall. Those of us who are old enough, David, I think you remember the Cold War. In the 70s and early 80s, none of us saw an ending to that without a nuclear holocaust.
That's because we never imagined that the Soviet Union or the United States could ever crumble from within.
That's right. And so I think part of what God is reminding us is don't ever think that what you think is impossible can't happen.
Right.
Whether collectively to any particular nation, even alive today, let alone in your own individual life, that you'll never be judged or punished by God because you get away with things for a while in this life. Judgment will come.
And I really do think that one is particularly important because I think that there tends to be a view of America that we're sort of special,
immune.
Well, and for a couple of reasons. Some just from the aspect of who's going to mess with us. We're the big kids on the block, and I think even some sort of think, well, I know we have our issues, but in the world we're special to God.
Yeah,
and
neither of those is true.
And the truth is, that's right.
Yeah.
That when He tires of our wickedness and it's full, then His wrath will be poured out on us.
Right.
He can deal with the most powerful nation in the world just like He can deal with the weakest. It's nothing to God.
He has taken out world powers before, in ways that they did not see coming or anticipate in their arrogance. And that's part of the lesson too, ironically, is it can happen in a way you did not anticipate and go far quicker than you thought. So
there's a warning there for us.
Well, because if we were to put the date of Nahum, there's a ballpark there, but Nahum may well have been delivered while Assyria was still at peak strength, and yet in a matter of a couple of decades, Nineveh goes from peak strength to devastated. You can fall fast. So there's that.
As you mentioned the Soviet Union, and that's exactly what we've seen in history.
That's right.
Recent history.
Yeah, again, in the early 80s, we were, people thought Reagan was going to get us destroyed with a nuclear holocaust. Not that by the end of the decade, by 1989,
it would all be over.
The Warsaw Pact is gone, and we're the ones that are saying history has ended, peace and security forever.
We're right about anything, are we?
Yeah. And I guess the last thing I'd add just real quick there, and you see this in verse 14, is often judgment comes as God saying basically, so much for the gods you trusted in your health and your wealth. I will make a fool of, again, we sit there and say, well, we don't worship gods today. Check your heart towards your retirement accounts, your trust in your doctor, whatever. We do have things that we put a lot of stock in ways that can become idolaters if we're not careful. And that's part of why we don't think we can ever fall. Or collectively our military. Who wouldn't we have the biggest military budget in the world, even bigger than China's by orders of magnitude. So therefore, we're invincible.
And yet
God says, I brought other gods down before.
Right. That's exactly it. Who are you really trusting in? And maybe that's actually sort of the positive counterpart that goes with that. The one to be trusting in is God.
Yeah.
In fact, since it is the political season, it's a good time to keep reminding folks of that.
Yeah, that's
Quit
right.
fretting about the rise and falls and the ups and downs of empires.
Yeah.
That's one of the messages of the prophets. That's been going out throughout all time.
Yeah.
And ultimately, God's the great conductor who oversees all of the drama that's going on.
Yeah.
And we just need to put our trust and confidence with Him. Know He'll do the right thing.
Yeah.
Work that stuff out. So Nahum, we're still thinking about divine judgment and working in chapter 1 this week. So spend some time reading that over. Also remember, our prophet for the month is Micah. And need to spend some time going through that over and over again. And if you have questions along the way about the reading, if you'll pitch them to one of us, we'll be glad to wrap those into the podcast as we go through the month of May.